What exactly is a boss fight in a video game? Typically, it's an event and an entire area designed around an encounter with a particularly deadly adversary. These enemy leaders generally have narrative significance, and winning the battle might represent a moment that can alter the flow of the story, or directly change the trajectory of a character's arc. This is the primary interpretation anyway. In some cases, boss fights can be far more subtle, so much so that you might not even know you're fighting someone significant. In a way, especially in the case of Halo, where you're often placed into the shoes of a deadly super soldier, the player is the boss fight. Now, what I mean by that is that you, or the Master Chief, carry far more agency and have the ability to make massive changes to the game's story. More so than, say, a random Kigyard soldier. To the nameless foes that are designed to be slaughtered with relative ease, you are the boss fight, in a battle of horrific proportions that they usually have no chance of winning. This is just the nature of this particular artistic medium though, and generally speaking, the fall of each Covenant soldier is met with zero fanfare. Their lives, aspirations, and stories are completely unknown to us. However, this isn't always the case, and oftentimes these creatures actually do have a story. In most scenarios, these details were added retroactively, but viewing these encounters with a newly created narrative patina completely recontextualizes them. A bit of backstory transforms an unremarkable moment into a potentially emotional event, or an entire world is wiped away. A single bullet permanently deletes all that the creatures ever were, and all they ever could have been. So that's what I want to talk to you about today. Halo Combat Evolved's secret bosses, named individuals that chances are you didn't even know you were fighting. Igido Nosa Hurru and Ogada Nosa Fasu are two quote-unquote bond brothers, a pair of hunter worm colonies, otherwise known as Megalite Golo. Megalite Golo are one of many different forms these creatures take, but this particular arrangement is geared towards defensive combat. Igido was a collection of older and therefore wiser Letgolo worms and preferred ranged combat. The younger of the two, Ogada, was much more direct, typically being the first to lead into battle. He relished in the rush of a firefight and had the propensity to storm out into the front lines with little regard for self-preservation. So far, this aggression had served him well, but the upcoming battle was unlike anything they'd experienced before, and the enemy that awaited them was more than the sum of his rumored actions. This particular familial unit was unusual, as in most bond brother pairings, their ages are quite close together. This is due to the fact that one individual typically spawns from the other when a colony becomes unsustainably large. Instead of like glowworms dying off, the extra mass separates from the greater whole and forms its own collective. Igido had never reached that point, and instead became bonded with the much younger Ogada. This means that their relationship was highly unusual and was much more akin to that of a father and son rather than siblings. The quote-unquote two of them were dispatched to guard the entrance of Installation 04's map room after the Master Chief had disabled a security measure put into place to prohibit him from entering the structure. Both Igido and Ogada had dug in on the outside of the Forerunner building and awaited the Master Chief's arrival. They knew all too well the dangers posed by their quarry, thanks to the fact that he was responsible for killing many of their kind. After they had successfully fortified their position and some time passed, they heard the distinct whine of an archaically designed human vehicle. The younger of the two gestalts waited in anticipation, eager to go wriggling toe to armored toe with one of the greatest enemies the Covenant had ever faced. Ogada was very skilled with the fuel rod cannon fixed to his arm, and because of that, he fully intended to use it. As the armored human approached, Ogada fired a round of molten death towards the approaching vehicle. The relatively slow-moving projectile arced and made its way towards the enemy and his four-wheeled beast. Ogada's aim was true, and the superheated glob impacted with the side of the automobile, flipped it over, and sent their target along with his softer, unarmored passengers rolling out of the vehicle. In response, the green-clad demon quickly shouldered a relatively large human weapon and pulled the trigger, letting loose a missile. The projectile careened forward at a frightening speed and inevitably made impact with Ogada's armor, but the thick metal simply wasn't enough to protect him from the explosion. Ogada erupted into a shower of flames and orange blood, hurling like Golo worms in all directions. Igido heard the sounds of the explosion and knew his bond brother had just been killed. In the blink of an eye, he had lost what amounted to his son. A suffocating wave of rage and sorrow immediately rippled through each and every worm within his hulking body. The pain caused by the loss of his kin was almost too much to bear, but within it he found a modicum of focus, and suddenly found himself welcoming the enemy's presence. He'd make the demon pay for what he'd done. Unfortunately for Igido, no amount of rage would aid him in what was to come. He was up against an unstoppable force, and this immovable object had started to budge. Perhaps it was the many years of battle, or the overwhelming pain suffocating all the smaller parts of his greater whole that led to his defeat. Whatever the case may be, when the chief let loose another rocket, an instant later, he rejoined his family. Isna Nosolee was a special operative elite commander that the chief never encountered, so he isn't technically a boss fight for the player, but I wanted to include him anyways. His rank was one created by the Sanshayum, or prophets, and was referred to as a Osuna, or an Eye of the Prophet. This particular designation was born out of the Covenant's necessity to gather information on their enemies. When he became an Osuna, he was inducted into a specialized subset of Sangheili that needed to be far more deliberate with who they chose to engage with in combat. Isna in particular was sent to one of the human spacecrafts to gather information by seizing the ship's AI, senior personnel, or any other useful information that might lead the Covenant to a human settlement. Capturing of the enemy was a very uncommon occurrence, but nonetheless it was occasionally necessary to find meaningful strongholds. Like basically every other soldier that found their way onto the ship, Isna boarded via a leech, the small tubular vehicle seen throughout the campaign mission, the Pillar of Autumn. Once on the enemy vessel and armed with the plasma pistol sidearm, he engaged an active camo module, rendering him partially invisible. With this useful piece of technology, he'd be able to sneak throughout enemy territory and easily complete his mission. After the other elites and grunts that had accompanied him within the leech had dispersed into the human ship, Isna slipped out and began slinking through the steel corridors ahead. Though he found his assignment distasteful, he carried out his orders without question, putting aside his natural inclination to fight honorably in favor of skulking about the human ship like a disgraceful wretch. In the end, orders were orders, and he wasn't about to heretically question his leaders, at least not loud enough for them to hear. After patrolling the ship for a while, he finally found himself aboard its bridge, and in the presence of what he had determined was the pilot of the craft. A human shipmaster would surely have valuable information, and was therefore exactly the type of personnel he had been sent to capture. He watched as the small, gray-haired creature scanned a screen of some kind before it slowly turned its head towards him. It gazed directly into Isna's cloaked eyes, but instead of alerting the other humans in the immediate vicinity, it just stared for a moment and rubbed its ocular organs. Isna held his breath and braced for an incoming barrage of gunfire, but it never came. Instead, the shipmaster and its compatriots began making their way out of the bridge. Isna was completely outnumbered, and if he had attempted to take the human now, its friends would have surely gunned him down. He had to wait and followed them until a better opportunity presented itself. Eventually, the humans made their way onto one of their cramped lifeboats, and Isna followed close behind, squeezing in as best as his large form could. As each of his enemies found a seat and strapped themselves in, he positioned himself in a corner, as far away from them as possible. His large body made it difficult to not accidentally brush against one of his adversaries, but he managed to remain undetected regardless. Before he knew it, the escape craft launched away from the ship and began maneuvering towards the surface of one of the holy rings. He watched the human shipmaster closely, no doubt eager to isolate him from the group and hopefully deal a devastating blow to the vermin of an adversary he loathed so entirely. Suddenly, the shipmaster spoke to one of the other humans enclosed in a tight space and reached for its weapon. In an instant, it raised the death-dealing device directly at Isna's head and fired 3 rounds. The first of the 2 ballistics pinged away thanks to his armor, but the third slipped through a small slit in his helmet, impacting with his skull and blowing it open like an overripe watermelon being smashed with a hammer. This so-called vermin of a shipmaster was none other than Captain Keyes. And the bullet he had just released not only launched Isna's sense of superiority over him free of his mind, but also literally everything else it contained. These 2 grunts are an unusual entry in this video, largely because they don't actually have any lore explaining who they are. I am certain that something exists though. Let me explain why. First of all, these 2 soldiers are actually very unique. At first glance, they appear to be the same as many of the other special ops fuel rod wielding Ungoi encountered throughout Halo CE's campaign, but their armor is unlike any encountered anywhere else in the game. In the original graphics, they look like a standard red grunt, aside from their weapon of choice. The most interesting aspect, however, is that they have their own unique model and anniversary visuals. No other red, gas mask-wearing Ungoi exists anywhere in the game, making these 2 very strange. There's a story here, I just know it. If anyone from Halo Studios is watching this, throw me a bone, man. Give me some info about these guys. Yes, I'm aware that this was more than likely an oversight by Bungie when they were developing the original version of Halo CE, but the inclusion of a special anniversary model calls greater attention to them and really makes me think there's some narrative that just hasn't been revealed here.
We can't let the flood get off this ring. You know what he'd expect. What he'd want us to do.
Zuka Zamamee was one of many special operative Sangheili soldiers within the fleet that pursued the Pillar of Autumn to Installation 04. When they all arrived above the enigmatic superstructure, he was tasked with infiltrating the human ship and eliminating its occupants. Within one of the many cramped halls of the spacecraft, he came directly in contact with the Demon, one of the deadliest soldiers that the humans had ever sent the Covenant's way. With such a fine prize in his sights, a sudden and strong sensation flooded through his body. Whether it was elation, fear, or anger is unclear, but whatever the case may be, it manifested outwardly as a sudden roar, followed by a salvo of plasma. Mere moments had passed during this exchange, but regardless of how little time Zuka had been fighting the demon, it was already too late. A well-aimed burst from his enemy's assault rifle impacted with his head, pinged off of his energy shielding, and broke through. One round bounced off of his skull, and instead of splattering his blue blood on the walls like a Jackson Pollock painting, it knocked him unconscious. His limp, mostly lifeless body would remain on the deck of the human ship until an unlikely rescue would take place. A particularly intelligent grunt by the name of Yayap would stumble upon the slumbering elite and make the unwise decision to aid in his evacuation. I actually have a video covering Yayap's entire story already. If you like grunts, you should go check that out. Link in the description. Trust me, it's a good one. When Zuka finally awoke, he would promote Yayap, and with a reluctant Ungoy in tow, formulate another plan to take revenge on the chief. Elites are a prideful, honor-bound race, and he intended to win back his honor by finding and killing the human who had humiliated him in combat. After he recovered from his injuries, he began formulating a plan to get revenge and hopefully rid the Covenant of an adversary he smartly believed to be one of the greatest threats ever encountered by their supergroup. Initially, his commanding officers were hesitant to grant him the resources he claimed were needed to hunt down the demon, but after he successfully infiltrated the Truth and Reconciliation and saved the humans that had been captured aboard, this decision was quickly reconsidered. By analyzing the footage of his quarry's assault on the Truth and Reconciliation and through other independent detective work, he had determined that his adversary's artificial companion was tapping into the Covenant BattleNet. His plan was to intentionally populate these communications with reports of the Holy Ring's control room. Reports that would be intercepted by the AI and thus lead them directly to a trap he had set up within the bowels of the Forerunner installation. The idea was to lead the demon into a darkened corridor, whereupon he, Yayap, a pair of Letgolo gestalts, and a contingent of other soldiers would spring forth from the darkness and catch their enemies unaware. This plan actually seemed as though it would be a success, and as he lied in wait within the cold emptiness of the Forerunner interior, reports of his adversary's approach streamed in. Death and destruction followed in the demon's wake, but Zuka's plan was solid. It would work. It had to if he were to ever regain his honor. The sounds of Covenant death grew louder and louder just outside of where he and his trap had been laid before falling silent. One of the hunters under his command stormed out into the open. This was it. The demon had fallen right into his trap. He prepared to open fire on his adversary, but one of the other Letgolo gestalts under his command knocked him to the ground before he could fire his weapon. He watched, likely in abject horror, as the ferocity of their enemy overtook them. Instead of joining the hunters in their bloody end, he opted to remain concealed in the darkness of an open cargo container, observing from afar as all hell broke loose. He watched as Yayap stumbled backwards, and before the demon was able to turn its attention to his Ungoy companion, he grabbed him and pulled him into the relative safety of his hiding spot. Together, they remained silent, waiting and watching as the demon passed them by and strolled further into Halo's substructure. Instead of pursuing, an act comparable to suicide, he and Yayap simply waited until the demon was far enough away for them to make their escape. When they returned to the Truth and Reconciliation with reports from their mission, the lesser prophet aboard the craft was very displeased. Zuka had failed, and the price of failure was high. Upon entering a chamber within the Covenant vessel, the location his meeting with the prophet was supposed to take place, he was met with a deeply disturbing sight. To properly showcase what could await him, the prophet had displayed the decapitated head of a superior officer in front of him, another elite soldier that had failed in his duties. If he was able to formulate a plan right here and right now that was conceivably achievable, he'd be allowed to live. So he thought up a plan, and he thought it up quick. It was insane, but the prophet was convinced that it could work. Since the humans had arrived on the Forerunner's majestic creation, they had created a base of operations on its surface. Zuka had surmised that the demon likely visited it frequently. His idea was to stage a crash nearby the human structure and place Yayap within the wreckage. His grunt companion would then be discovered by the humans, taken as a prisoner, and brought back to the base. Thanks to a communications device embedded within his breathing apparatus, he could signal the elite when he finally saw their adversary, at which point Zuka would trigger a raid via a stolen human dropship. Amazingly, this entire plan went off without a hitch, and before he knew it, Zuka was slaughtering his way through the stronghold on his way to retrieve Yayap. When he finally reunited with his compatriot, he was led towards the demon's location and informed that their adversary had been assigned to oversee several stolen banshees. They fought their way to the aircraft, and Yayap managed to save Zuka's life once again with a well-placed plasma grenade into a group of enemy opposition. The two made it outside into the vehicles, but the chief was nowhere to be found. Zuka was confused. He had shown nothing but respect to Yayap, going as far as to promote him to his own personal unit, and yet it seemed as though his diminutive compatriot had lied to him. There was no demon here. The squatty Ungoi soldier pointed his plasma pistol at Zuka's head and threatened to pull the trigger if he didn't climb into the Banshee and fly them both out of there. With no other options in mind, he did as requested and begrudgingly flew the two of them away. He felt many things on their uncomfortable flight: betrayal, physical discomfort, and anger were at the forefront of his internal sensations, but nothing matched the strength of his newly formed hopelessness. He was doomed. There was no other way to slice it. He had failed again and had been taken hostage by an Ungoi, no less. Despite this, Zuka wasn't willing to give up. Once the unlikely duo made their way far from the human stronghold, they flew towards the spacecraft that their enemies had crashed onto the ring. They were running low on supplies, and thanks to the fact that the Covenant had taken possession of the vessel, it was likely the best place to acquire some more. The problem was, Zuka was almost certainly going to be killed by his prophet leader if he showed his face. Yayap was smart though, and he suggested that he simply assume the identity of a senior official and hope for the best. This plan was a success, and together they found themselves within the adversarial spacecraft once again. Zuka wasn't about to end his hunt for the Master Chief, however, and as soon as he was back among his compatriots, he began formulating a new plan. He was desperate at this point, and as far as he was concerned, his only chance of survival lied with the death of the demon. So, when word got out that their enemy had actually returned to their previously owned vehicle, Zuka was the first to volunteer to eliminate this new threat. His next crudely formed goal was a plan similar to his last. Yayap would stay behind and feed him information about the demon's whereabouts. Zuka would take a contingent of his compatriots, find a place to wait, and ambush his enemy once he approached. If Yayap did his job properly, Zuka would be aware that their ultimate enemy was close, and therefore could finally eliminate the target in a surprise attack. Shockingly, Zuka still trusted Yayap to accomplish this task, likely due to the growing sense of desperation within him. No one else could know about his failure, and therefore no one else could be trusted to assist him now. Here's where things get a little contradictory. Keep in mind that all of this information comes from a book called The Flood, a novelization of Halo CE. It's all 100% canon, but in some unusual cases, the gameplay doesn't reflect the content of the book. That doesn't mean that it shouldn't be accepted as truth, however. Gameplay is often not directly indicative of what occurs during the narrative. This information is often intentionally kept vague to leave room for additional story tidbits such as this, and to account for the freedom of choice regarding the different combat strategies potentially employed by the player. With all of that said, do you remember this elevator and the group of enemies that accompany it? The elite in the middle is Zuka. In the book, he's firmly sat within a Covenant shade turret, but the dangerous piece of weaponry made no difference against a foe like the Master Chief. As soon as the demon laid eyes on him, he tossed a few frag grenades into the elevator, and suddenly it began to descend. The AI accompanying him must have lowered the mechanism, but at this point, it didn't matter. Zuka began to panic as he fell. He was stuck in a confined space with a few Ungoi and several explosive devices, rapidly propelling away from the enemy he sought, his only chance of redemption falling away even quicker than his own physical body. The explosives detonated, sent Zuka flying into the air and granted him one last look at the demon, but what goes up must come down, and a 150-kilogram creature is absolutely going to come down. Hard. As he fell, I can only imagine that his thoughts lingered on his failed attempts to kill the demon, but at least he'd die an honorable death, fighting one of the greatest enemies the Covenant had ever known. When Zuka landed, he heard a loud snap, the last sound he would ever hear, and the sound of his neck breaking. Just like that, his revenge quest ended. Alright, well, that's all I've got. If you enjoyed this video and you want something similar for Halo 2, where I talk about all the different bosses in Halo 2 like this, let me know in the comments. I might make that. This was fun. And it was a nice break from the massive bestiaries that I keep making. The Half-Life one that I just did took a lot out of me, and it wasn't super successful. So if you want to help me out and you're still here, you should go watch that, or some other video that I've made, perhaps. YouTube likes that. Otherwise, like, comment, subscribe, all the other usual crap that you hear in every other video that you watch, I'm sure. Yeah, that's all I got. So if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna go play some Halo. Yeah. Maybe lasso, because I like to torture myself. See ya.